right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the October 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for both the South Atlantic and the Southeast Conservation Blueprints. And as you probably know, we host this Web Forum on the third Thursday of every month here at 10 a.m., and it's intended to give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the future of conservation in our region. So I'll start out just with our usual agenda. I'll start by introducing our presenter. We'll hear for 30 to 40 minutes about the monthly topic. There'll be time at the end for Q&A and discussion, and then I'll wrap up by previewing our November webinar and then giving some updates from your Blueprint staff. So I'm going to put us in silent mode so that we don't have any background noise, which means if you need to speak up at any time, you'll just press *6 to unmute your line, or you can always pose questions using the chat box. Just a quick reminder that we are recording this web forum, and the slides and the video will be linked from the calendar event on the South Atlantic LCC website within a day or two. So before I mute everybody, does anyone have questions or comments?
The conference is now in silent mode.
All right, so with that, I'm going to hand things off to our speaker, Dr. Daniel Slone. He's a research ecologist with the USGS Wetland and Aquatic Research Center. And Rua is also going to be providing a quick introduction to talk a little bit about the context behind this project. Then we'll get into some more depth about this work, looking at predicting future salt marsh change along the South Atlantic coast. So I'm going to hand things over to you, Dan. Just hit *6 to unmute your line when you're ready to speak.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, all right, do what we practice.
Beautiful.
All right, that came out. Did that come across?
Looks great, and you sound great. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And I think that Rua wanted to say a few words before we get started.
Yeah, I'm just going to set this up real quickly about how we got to where we are and how this project came about. So this is part of a larger effort to forecast the past, present, and future conditions of South Atlantic indicators, part of the state of the South Atlantic, part of the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. And so, originally the idea we started with was, hey, we have some past data on salt marsh change, just from land cover models. And then, NOAA has some marsh migration models that predict the future. And so maybe we can just squish those two together and then start thinking about how that might respond to ecosystems and how that might change into the future. And so we started from, let's use the existing information we have out there. And what we found is that when we took the kind of past trends of how salt marshes changed and then these future predictions of marsh migration, they really didn't line up. The patterns were very different. The trends were very different because there's a lot of, folks know the future migration predictions don't take into account a lot of the various changes. They're kind of a best case scenario, and we weren't exactly getting there. And so we realized as a larger group, in order to figure out what was going on with salt marshes in general into the future and all the different indicators, we needed a different way of looking at how salt marshes might change along the South Atlantic coast. And so that's how we got to get to what Dan's going to be talking about. All yours, Dan.
All right, thanks. So I'm Dan Slone. I'm a research ecologist with the Geological Survey. And so myself and my partner, Steve Hartley, worked on this project. So the way we divided up is, I was kind of in charge of thinking about the ecological processes and what kinds of modeling efforts to apply. And Steve, the geographer, he did like pretty much all the heavy lifting. There's a lot of giant data sets here, and putting them all together and making sure they all line up, and then taking the modeling information and then applying it in that kind of large scale GIS application so that we could apply what we're doing across the entire southeast landscape and for the next 100 years. And then, obviously in cooperation with Rua Mordecai and Amy Keister from the Conservation Blueprint Science Applications, used to be the LCC, and that's complicated. But more than our financial sponsors, which they were very integrated components in this, and providing guidance and data sets and kind of overall direction for this project. And I need to highlight my thing so I can change there. So I probably don't need to go into a lot of background on why salt marshes and coastal estuaries are important. But straight from the NOAA website, they are essential for healthy fisheries. They provide refuge for a lot of fishery species. They're a very productive habitat type, and they physically protect our shoreline from erosion and flooding. So they provide a lot of services that we really depend on economically and ecologically. And when you look at distributions of salt marshes across the world, you see that they're in the mid latitudes, and the upper latitudes are the most dense salt marshes. And the area that we're working in, the southeast United States, is one of the ecological hotspots where there's just a lot of salt marsh activity. There's a lot of biological activity and physical processes going on. So it's a super important part of the South Atlantic landscape. And as we know, they're under constant threat from rising seas, where this has been looked at many times, and the news is kind of never good for the coastal U.S. That as seas rise, it hits those low marshes first. And when you look at this spatially, you can see this is a model that was produced. You can see that as the seas rise, it's modeled to hit those Spartina marshes, those low marshes, really hard. So the question is, what's going to happen? Are those marshes going to be able to migrate? Are we going to lose the marshes more than we're going to lose the uplands? Kind of how are those processes going to take place? Here's another case study with some really nice graphics. Just some 1930 aerial photograph of our salt marsh and our palustrine wetland forest. And what you see is that in the present time, that edge has eroded, and that continues to occur. That this is the salt marsh to forest edge, and it is eroding because the ocean is pushing into the salt marsh, and the salt marsh is pushing into the palustrine forest. And that's the exact process that we're trying to replicate here. Here's just some more pictures from that same study. You can actually see as things are moving, you get dead trees first, and then moving the marshes inland. Plenty of research has been done on looking at when waters rise. Does the salt marsh keep up? Does it get flooded? Does it migrate into the other habitats? So there's plenty of field work that's been done, and there's of course process-based models that have looked at if we raise up the sea level and then we apply these processes that we've seen from field work, then what does our landscape look like? And so the modeling that we are working on here is an empirical-based model based on past data and looking to see if we can project those patterns into the future. And then we can compare what we get with a process-based model and see where they differ and see why that might be. Is the empirical data, is it going to change from the process because the process may say, hey, there's some new channels that are going to open up and that's going to increase erosion or something like that. So by having an empirical model and these process-based models that already exist, we can kind of look at which processes might be important in the future. So our questions for this project, again, it's an empirical model of measured trends, and we want to look at relative risk of which habitats are going to move or which habitats are going to lose or gain. And so the palustrine kind of upland marshes compared to the estuarine marshes. If the estuarine marshes migrate faster than the ocean is intruding, then you'll have an increase in salt marsh. But if the ocean intrudes faster than the salt marsh can move, then you'll have a loss of salt marsh as it bumps up against those palustrine habitats. And so we want to know how much of those habitats we're going to gain or lose, and also an associated question: how far upstream does this transition actually occur? And so the reason for doing this is to inform the South Atlantic Blueprint, which is it's a very cool site, and it has like 31, I think, indicators of ecological health in the Southeast, and it's all on a multi-scale level, and then grouped together for priority locations. It's really cool. So we're looking at these coastal areas where there's already indicators of estuarine health. There's threats, including sea level rise, for each of these different cells. And so we want to take our information and inform all of these processes here. So this is the spatial area of the Southeast, the blueprint. The Southeast used to be the LCC. And if you zoom in on this, not all of these subregions, there's several subregions here, not all of them contain this marsh habitat. So if we look only at those subregions, we have the North Coastal Plain, approximately North Carolina, but these do not correspond to state boundaries. This is approximately around North Carolina. Central Coastal Plain, which is approximately South Carolina. South Coastal Plain, which is a lot of Georgia and parts of Northeast Florida. And then we combined the Gulf Coastal Plain and the Gulf Marine. So that's that small polygon down below. Because both of those contain the estuarine habitat. And so we combine those into kind of one meta region. And those are the four regions in which we're going to look at. So the inputs that we used, again, we already talked about that there's these land cover databases. So we looked at the National Land Cover Database, which is available, and it has a lot of past years already input, 2001 through 2016. However, we also used, we actually primarily used the CCAP land cover analysis, which is similar to but different from the National Land Cover. And it's only available from 2001, 2006, and 2011, but it's at a much higher, not a spatial resolution, but it's a much higher habitat resolution. So when we look at that, we see that there's many land cover types in the NLCD as well as the coastal change. But if you look a little bit more closely, the open water in the NLCD is approximately 4 different habitats in the coastal change. The same with the woody wetlands, which is that palustrine habitat, which is divided into 3, and then your herbaceous wetlands, which are mostly the salt marshes if you're looking at in the saline environment. Those are then your estuarine, forested, scrub, and emergent. So from 3, we go to about 10 different habitat types, and that allowed us to get a little more fine scale on which habitats we're looking at migrating. So we took these 3 CCAP layers, which once we settled on that, as Rua said, this was a while in already getting to this. What are we going to actually use as our data input? So we took the 3 CCAP data layers, and we started looking at changes. So what we're looking at is where open water invades salt marsh, and sorry about all these colors. This is kind of my work product to see where all these things were happening. But you see the blue that's happening on this coastline here. This is a riverine coastline. That's actually a coastal coastline. But the salt marsh being invaded by open water is is that blue that's along the edges. And there's also other processes going on. This is kind of what we're looking at. This where is open water moving into the salt marsh habitat, and also where is the salt marsh moving into any of the palustrine habitats. And we very quickly started running into problems that when you have a large-scale national database like this, there's always going to be compromises made in habitat classifications. And so, for example, where you see here along this is a northern coast of North Carolina, the Barrier Island, where you see right along the edge, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here, but right along here on the edge where the open ocean meets the land, it's showing open water invading that habitat, and that's showing as grassland habitat. And what that actually should be is a beach and dune habitat, which is not really classified. That's one of the issues that we ran in very quickly, is we were noticing, I'm going to move this slide down, that a lot of what you see as grassland is beach and dune, as in this open coastal area, and that was being eroded away. But here's an identified Spartina marsh that also is classified as grassland. And that is very common as well, as you'll see a Spartina marsh classified as grassland instead of as a salt marsh. And we definitely wanted to include the Spartina. And so we had to kind of deal with this grassland habitat. And here's some more of the same. Right along the coast, you have identified grassland, which is actually your beach and dune habitat, maybe dune grasses. And then in the backwaters, you have grassland, which is actually salt marsh. So it's the same classification, but two different habitats. Other issues, if you look at more of the uplands, you have influence of human disturbance, such as this mosaic of grassland to forested, which is really what is logging. So you have these different logging parcels, and as different areas are logged, they turn from one habitat to another in the classification. And we really did not want to account for that in our model. Same with urbanization. This is a different process. We don't want to incorporate that as well. And finally, sometimes some agricultural lands are flooded at times when these pictures are taken, and so they can transition from a palustrine wetland to open water simply because of tidal effects. More tidal effects in some of these photos, where you see just along the fringes of the river systems will be this salt marsh transitioning to something else. And that something else might be open water, it might be grassland, it might be coastal development, or might be tidal changes. So we wanted to be very careful not to include any of this in a salt marsh migration model, but at the same time, we did not have the resources and did not want to do a lot of handwork where we're going through and picking out pixels. That's just impossible. There's way too many pixels, way too much area to cover. So we needed a process to work through. So looking at all these changes and what we wanted to look at, we chose to concentrate on these different habitats in the CCAP, which was, again, the grassland, but only in certain areas, and then the palustrine, estuarine, and the open water categories. The ones that are not chosen generally don't occur in this area. And just some description. So when we see this unconsolidated shore barren land, when you see that it's subject to inundation and redistribution, we classified that as open water because that, ecologically it's open. It's just a water type that is sometimes exposed. And then you have true open water and the palustrine aquatic bed, which may have subsurface vegetation, but for purposes of this model, it's also considered open water. Estuarine wetlands were classified, and again, this is straight from CCAP, classified as whether it was emergent, scrub, or forested wetlands, So these are all tidal wetlands. And then the palustrin is more of the uplands, more of the freshwater, emergent wetlands, scrub, and forested. And finally, the grassland, dominated by graminoid or herbaceous vegetation. And so from this CCAP description, we actually went down and collapsed it again into three different habitats, open water, saltwater marsh, and palustrin. And grasslands was classified as a saltwater marsh, but only within this marine buffer zone that we created. I'm going to talk about that. So how do we take all of this information, this CCAP, and all of these buffers that we want to make? How do we create all these? So let's zoom in on this portion of the North Carolina coast. This is an aerial photo, and this is the CCAP classification of that, and the different colors are not terribly important right now. I'm going to go through that same classification that we did before. Let's take away the classification. The first thing that we wanted to address was any of this dune and beach, kind of habitat information. So we created an open ocean buffer where anything that was connected straight to the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf Coast without any intervening barrier islands, that was created as a polygon and then buffered 300 meters inshore so that any grasslands that were on top of what from the NLCD, the barren land. So this is kind of a mashup of these different land cover models. If the CCAP calls it a grassland and the NLCD called it barren land, then we called it dunes. And save that for later, but those are taken out for the purposes of this model because we are only looking at the salt marshes. And then converted all the rest of the grasslands into salt marsh and converted all the palustrins into, again, palustrin, all the estrin into estrin, and the different waters into water. So we have this three different habitat type map to work with. Now we need to get rid of both upland water and upland palustrin and upland salt marsh because we know that as of this point, those are misclassified because we classified all the grasslands. So we only want the ones right near the salt water. So from the NOAA digital vector shoreline, we have a water layer, which also includes all of the upland waters and has tiny lakes and all those things. And so we grabbed this and then applied some connectivity filters and things like that to it. We also have this migration space layer that was created as part of a Nature Conservancy Resilient Coastal Sites Assessment for the blueprint. And so this was an analysis mostly based on topography on where ocean water could kind of migrate or invade into. So we wanted to take out any of the uplands from this, and also we wanted to take away any areas that were too far away from water. So this is our connected open water layer. Took that open water and then forced it to be connected to the marine environment. So anything that's not connected was taken out. So that takes out all the lakes and all the upland areas, takes out all the agricultural ponds. And then by also cutting to the migration space, it takes the rivers that are upstream out of the picture as well. We chose some values for these parameters that we thought were reasonable, and that's something that can be changed easily. We can change the migration space so that it migrates further in or further out, and we can also change this buffer. So maybe 120 meters is too large or too small, so you can easily change this and rerun this process. So when we're done with that, our actual marsh migration landscape is this kind of strip around ocean-connected water that is palustrin habitat, salt marsh habitat, and then everything else. And then our process was we have open water, which is allowed to migrate into saltwater marsh, and saltwater marsh is allowed to migrate into palustrine wetlands. But open water does not invade any of the other upland habitat, and saltwater marsh does not invade any of the other upland habitat. So that we use those as a mask. And so let's look at some numerical results. This is based strictly on once we made this migration landscape, then we went from 2001 to 2006 to 2011, and we counted the pixels that changed from one habitat to the next habitat between those years. Put those into a simple linear model and extrapolated it out. And again, this is one of the areas that can be easily changed. You may feel that a linear extrapolation is not what's going to happen. Most of the sea level rise models that are robust predict an accelerating change. So you can easily put that accelerating curve into your extrapolation and then run the results. So this is just kind of our first cut. Let's just do a linear extrapolation. We only have 3 years of input data, and so the error bars get quite large as you go into the out years. So this is measuring hectares of change. You can see that it's predicted that the southern coastal plain, that area around Georgia, is expected to have the most change, up to 2,000 hectares of palustrine wetland loss up to the year 2000 and 2100. And most of that is the open water intruding. In all of the habitats except for the Gulf and coastal plain, the salt marsh is predicted to lose the race, and that it means that the open water, based on the past experience, the open water is accelerating faster than the salt marsh can migrate into the palustrine wetland. So even though we're losing palustrine wetland, we're losing even more salt marsh. So to restate it, if the salt marsh was keeping up, then the palustrine wetland would be taking all the losses and the salt marsh would remain steady. So if we look at it from a percent change, it's compared to the huge amount of habitat that's out there, these percentages do not seem overly large. But again, this is a straight line extrapolation and does not assume any acceleration in these processes. So you may want to assume an acceleration, or you may want to assume some sort of a step process because the salt marshes are so flat that you may assume that they inundate as a step rather than as a slow, gradual process. So you can plug all of those assumptions into the model pretty easily. So when you look at it as a percentage function, then the central coastal plain is the one that is expected to have the most salt marsh loss, and then the northern coastal plain and the southern coastal plain behind. And again, the Gulf coastal plain is not showing an appreciable loss in percentage of salt marsh. And we're going to get into why I think that is. So how do we apply these numerical modeling results back to the landscape so that we can apply it to the spatial blueprint? So we use a spatial convolution model. I'm not going to get into the details of that right now. I have a paper queued up that I can put on the screen, and I can go through that at the end if people are interested. But it's essentially a spatial blur type of a filter where it calculates how much it needs to move and then moves it stepwise on a very smooth fashion from one habitat into the next. And it keeps track of how much it's moving so that you don't lose any of your you don't lose any pixels. You just migrate them from one habitat to the next. So let's start up north coastal plain. This is an area in Pamlico Sound, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So we have this kind of typical North Carolina coastal habitat of your salt marsh moving very quickly into forests and agricultural fields. And this is interpreted in the CCAP with this three-color scheme, again, with the blue, the yellow, and the red being open water, salt marsh, and then the palustrine habitat. And this is the 2001 CCAP. And then if we keep an eye on certain areas. So this first arrow, this is a protected salt marsh where the water is only penetrating as a small stream. And then down here we have exposed salt marsh where it is a kind of a tongue sticking out. And then we have areas where the palustrine wetland is really close to the open water. And you can see how that converts into salt marsh in the model. I'm going to leave these arrows up here. As we go through 2020, you see very quickly that the first thing to change appears to be the palustrine is being invaded by the salt marsh as the salt marsh is getting that pressure from the ocean. And then as you go through the decades, you can see that exposed salt marsh down at the bottom and those small salt marsh islands are eroded the most quickly. And the protected salt marsh, which is only attached to a very small amount of water, experiences the least amount of change. And this is kind of an inherent function of this spatial convolution, in that if it's surrounded by the lower habitat, it's going to be moved into from all different sides. So it kind of automatically accounts for this amount of exposure to the elements. And so moving down into the central coastal plain, this is an area of the Little River. So again, we have beach habitat going into this riverine where you have the lower salt marsh, and then very quickly into managed forest land and residential. And so all that residential and managed forest land is taken out of the model, leaving us with and the dunes are taken out of the model, leaving us with which should only be saltwater marsh and then the palustrine. Now, when you have such an interconnected salt marsh landscape, here with the convolution model predicts that this type of a habitat will be eroded much more quickly than the more protected upriver. And because this is the central plain, it has a higher rate of predicted erosion as well. So we're doing the prediction on a region-by-region level. This can easily be subsection to even be smaller regions, and that could probably give much more realistic results because impact of sea level rise and impact of coastal erosion is very much a local process. And so if you take your data from a local area, do your calculations from the past, then you can predict into the future with a lot more certainty. Moving down to the southern coastal plain, this is more of an inland site, so Fancy Bluff Creek. So again, very similar. We have these forests. Then we have the palustrine, and then very quickly we have the open saline water. And the model predicts the ocean transforming that palustrine very quickly into salt marsh, and the salt marsh again being eroded away. But all of the uplands do not change. Now the southern coastal plain, it's kind of dominated by this kind of landscape, which is just your very dominant salt marsh right out into the Atlantic Ocean. And if we go back, you'll notice something. I'm going to point this out more to the Gulf coastal plain. The CCAP model does not really have the really small channels built into it because the pixels are 30 meters wide. And so we're going to see that even more strongly with the Gulf. And I think that's why the Gulf is not showing as much erosion. So one improvement could be to allow the water layer, the the NOAA water polygon to inform where we have saltwater, intrusion, rather than using this pixelated water. So it's going to be a kind of an improvement in the future. But when you look at this just salt marsh dominated habitat, the model again shows that the ocean is intruding into where it can reach, and not really getting into any of the palustrine areas. So we can move down to the Econfina River in the Gulf Coast. And again, when we look at the sea cap habitat types, and I put that aerial map back on there, yeah, you can see that these really small channels are just not represented in the sea cap. And so when you look at coastal erosion processes, very similar to the other landscapes, but it only occurs where the sea cap has open water, and only open water that is connected to the Gulf. So again, this is using the actual data of which pixels changed, but then only applying it where the open water can reach. So that might be an issue that we need to address. I'm going to go back to this slide here. If you notice the color changes, so the color changes where it's grading from blue to yellow. This is an exaggerated color scale. So those changes are only a few percentage risk of change. So this is showing the risk of change of each of the pixels. But the actual process as to how this happens, and when you can see it in the data, it's not all of the coast changing all at once. It's a section. It's a small section changing because of some event. The habitat changes occur generally because there's a pressure, and then something happens, causes a state change, and then that state change persists. And so this is a new paper kind of going into this ecological ratchet model where it's looking at the sea level rise. And you can see this in many habitats with western grasslands. There's a fire, and then it's a different system. Or the bark beetles change the number of generations they can have in the mountains. So all of a sudden they are more abundant. You lose the trees, and then the trees don't come back. So these habitat changes are happening in pulses. So when you look at this risk map, it's a risk of change, but it's not implying that every single one of those pixels is going to change that little bit. It's saying this is where this risk is, and then a few of these pixels that were calculated by the numerical model, this is the number of pixels are chosen based on the risk of this. We just don't know which pixels those are going to be. We're just projecting that this is the area where that change will happen in some of these areas. So I hope I made that clear. And so finally, what we want to do with this, of course, is to incorporate it into the blueprint so that we can inform the other indicators, such as, the marsh birds and all of the species that depend on these habitats. When the habitats are changing, then that can inform how these other species are reacting to those habitat changes. That's what we would like to do in the future, and that is my last slide. And I don't know what we do now. Open up the star 6 for everybody for questions.
Yeah, I'm going to take us out of silent mode, Dan, so it's easier for us to interact. So hang on for a second.
The conference is now in talk mode.
All right, so everyone's line is open. They can now manage mute just using the mute button on their own phone. So who would like to jump in with questions?
Hello, Dan. This is Hong Kim.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi. You just mentioned that you have a paper on the model itself. And do you mind, list the paper you just published?
So the paper that I have queued up, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it over. It is not on this model. It is on some spatial convolution modeling that I've done in the past that explains the spatial convolution process. So this project, that we're just working on it now, so we do not have this one published. But let me bring up. So if I slide that over, does everyone see that on the screen?
Yeah, that's coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can definitely send this one. This is basically talking about the spatial convolution process in general, and this paper is especially on how when you make your grain size large, and so you make your spatial convolution kernel small, you actually don't get the results that you think that you're getting based on the math, because this discretizing process loses information. And so it talks about how to improve the accuracy of your model so that when you're looking at real data and you say, I want to move this much, that your model actually is moving what you think it's moving. So yeah, I can definitely send this out. I've got some other papers where I've applied the spatial convolution to different modeling processes.
Yeah, if you have a link to that, Dan, I could just pop it in the chat box so anyone who's interested could see it, or whatever is the easiest way.
Yeah, let's see if it's available. I think I have it available on my research gate.
Okay.
You can go there really quickly.
Yeah, sure. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Might just give Dan a minute to hunt down that link so I can share that with you folks. Are there any other questions in the meantime?
Hey, Dan, this is Ryan Boyles with the Climate Adaptation Science Center. So, I've been trying to spin up on marsh migration models and understand those more broadly. And I sort of like your approach of trying to rely on data instead of the modeling approach alone, where there's so many different models. They all seem to kind of be all over the place. But you're right in that they all predict much more rapid transition than what you're counting for with your rates. I'm wondering if there's another way. I mean, the big limitation I see there is you've got 3 data points for your trends. And
right.
Is there another way to aggregate, substitute some space for time type of approaches that would give you some more data points and give you maybe a better sense of the historical trend and how that's going into the future? I'm even wondering if since we've got Landsat going back further, if it's a different reclassification scheme, or if there's some other mechanism that would allow you to eke a little more confidence out of that trend from more than just 3 data points.
Yeah, and then that's an excellent point. And one that I'm very fully aware, the two big limitations here are the 3 data points and that kind of straight line extrapolation, which I don't think it's realistic. It's just kind of it's a step. It's like, this is what's been happening, and this is what would happen if we did it in the future. But I'd like to do a couple of things. I would like to incorporate sea level rise, because this has no sea level rise in it at all. This relies only on what habitat has actually changed over. And we went back and forth on our, what do we have, like bi-monthly phone calls. The 4 of us have bi-monthly phone calls on this, and we go back and forth on ideas and where we want to take it. And that was one of the early decisions is let's stick with just data. Let's see what just data can get us, and resist the urge to get into modeling processes. But the next step, I would like to incorporate sea level rise projections by looking at that migration space and then looking at the past sea level measurements and associating those with the 3 data points. And then you can kind of do a line from, all right, here's the data point here, here's the sea level at that point, and then here's this migration space map that we have. Let's connect all those together and then project forward using that relationship so that the sea level rise itself will be a model, but then it'll come back to the landscape. It'll come back to data, which is that migration space. And then that'll inform us on how rapid things are moving in. And we can say, okay, if it's moving in that rapidly, how many pixels of each landscape are there? And that can inform our rate of change. And it'll probably be a complex shape rather than a straight line. And then go back and do the spatial convolution on that again. So it's kind of an iterative approach. Again, we're still working with the same 3 data points. Another thing that we could try is, since we went through the CCAP and then we collapsed it down into the 3 different habitats again, maybe look back at the NLCD. Now, it's not just took that habitat and changed it over. If anyone has looked at those 2 data sets, they really are different. So they make a lot of different assumptions. So it would be a very different base map, but I wonder if the patterns would be very similar. And now that we have most of these processes automated, I think that we could pretty much plug them in using the NLCD, and then say, okay, we're going to do NLCD, we're going to change this into these habitats, we're going to apply our marine and water buffers, and then hit go, and kind of let it grind away. So I didn't mention that we started this in ArcMap Model Builder, but kind of quickly outgrew it. And so I moved to R Spatial for most of the buffering and the buffering and the convolution. And then Steve takes those and does kind of a combination of R for doing the convolution and then ArcMap for applying all of it to the giant data sets, kind of a thing. So it's kind of a mishmash right now, the workflow. But moving to R has really made it a lot more rapid. So I want to give a little plug for the R Spatial tool. It's increased the workflow speed by 7 to 10 times. It's not even a little bit.
One other thing to add, this is Rua on the trends, since you brought up the other marsh migration models, Ryan, is that what hit us was so striking is that when we looked at like the NOAA marsh migration, which is kind of what we have for the Atlantic, it was predicting over the next few decades increases in salt marsh, not decreases. And so it wasn't just that they didn't match up. It was like you saw look at the current trends, it's declining in different rates across all these, even though it's 3 data points. And then you look at the marsh migration models, which albeit make a lot of assumptions are sort of best case. It was like, wow. So that is completely not even the same direction at least within the next few decades. And so that was very, very striking.
Right. And then the stuff that Matt Kerwin's doing that's real site specific is showing a completely different set of directions too for in those individual locations. It's all over the place. I mean, it's a real challenge when you there's not even community agreement on the right approach to take. And so it's nice to be able to anchor back onto some data and say, well, okay, if nothing else, we can agree that, these are at these 3 time steps, this is the trend that's happening. And you hinted at one of the other challenges, and that is that a lot of the migration, these ecosystem migration functions are stepwise, right? A big event comes through, you get an inundation, it kills off the pine forest, and then you've got space for marsh to move in relatively quickly if there's enough, salt water to support it. But how quickly can that habitat actually occupy? There's questions there. And then the other thing is coming back to those 3 data points that you're looking at. In many ways, they're snapshots that try to aggregate all of those processes into a single snapshot for each of those data points. And of course, it's not a smooth transition. It is a combination of year-to-year variation and then maybe some big stepwise changes. it's a real challenge. It's interesting to see this. Really, I applaud you for taking sort of a different approach to it.
Thanks for that great question, Ryan. We could probably take one or two more. Anyone else want to jump in? Going once. Going twice.
All right. So Hillary, I'm sending just the titles of a couple of the papers.
Great.
I'm sending them by email to you. I cannot link to them. One of them doesn't have a public link. I think maybe, I'm not sure. I think one of them does and one of them doesn't. These two papers that I'm citing. And so I can attach them for you, and you can send them to everyone, or they can link to my ResearchGate profile and click on them there, and then I can send the papers that way, or they just email me. I don't know which way is easiest.
What I can do is send this out. I should have the emails of everyone who registered, so I could just follow up with everyone via email after.
And this is Diane Perkins. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the presentation, and I don't think I pre-registered, but I would love to receive that as well.
No, you didn't need to register. It was just when you logged in to the meeting today. I think you had to provide an email, and so I should be able to pull that.
Great. Will we get a copy of the presentation too?
The recording and the slides will be posted on the calendar event on the South Atlantic LCC website within about 1 or 2 days. So if you can always email me and I can send you a direct link to those as well.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Anybody else? Okie doke. Well, then I'm going to take back presenter power here and just wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and giving you a couple of quick updates from South Atlantic and Southeast Blueprint staff. Let me share my screen one more time. So next month, I think probably this is likely to be of interest to the types of folks who wanted to tune in today for this salt marsh webinar. Next month, the web forum is going to be on November 21st, same time, same connection information as today. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Mark Anderson and Annalee Barnett with the Nature Conservancy. About a year ago, they presented to us on progress with their Resilient Coastal Sites project. And so next month, we'll be getting the final results of that effort. So this is really looking at how resilience varies across the South Atlantic coast, giving coastal sites a resilient score based on the likelihood that the coastal habitat in that area would be able to migrate to adjacent lowlands. And their work is showing that with no action, our region could experience an estimated 77% loss of existing tidal habitat to severe inundation. But there are some sites that would be really good candidates for work to increase resilience to reverse this trend. So definitely encourage you to tune into their webinar for more information on that. Couple of quick staff updates. We are going to be presenting at a couple of symposia coming up soon. 2 at the Land Trust Rally, which is this weekend in Raleigh, the Raleigh Rally. So you can join RUA at a symposium on conserving wildlife corridors tomorrow at 1:30 if you happen to be in town for this conference. And you could also see Louise Vaughn presenting on local applications of regional conservation data on this Saturday at 1:30 as well. So if you're in town for Raleigh, definitely check those out and learn about how the blueprint's being applied to these interesting conservation questions. And then if you're coming to the SIAFWA, Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies annual meeting next week, or the week after actually, definitely come to the symposium on the CCAS 10% goal, which will be Tuesday, October 29th from 8 a.m. to noon. So just a couple of quick plugs for that. And building on this update for SIAFWA, I just wanted to let everybody know that the latest version of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, version 4.0, is going to be released next week in time for SIAFWA. So will the Recent Trends in Southeastern Ecosystems report. That's kind of our first report out on progress toward the CCAS 10% goal. Those will both be available next week in advance of that CAFWA symposium. So with that, I'll pause one more time for questions. All right, so that's really all we have for today. I always like to wrap up with this slide, which I got a little out of order today, but encourage you to join the South Atlantic LCC web community to get a monthly newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this web forum. You can always reach out to your Blueprint staff. That's me and Amy and Rua and Mallory and Louise here in Raleigh. And of course, we encourage you to explore the Conservation Blueprint online and let us know how it's working for you or if we can help you use it to inform your conservation work. So thank you so much for tuning in today. You'll get an email from me later with those papers that Dr. Slone mentioned, and we hope that you'll join us next month. Thanks, everybody.